from the Mexico Foreign Ministry. The Mexico consul was the one who released the information about this death at a detention center. This is the fifth migrant to die in ICE custody this year, and it's only mid-January. Every 3 days, one human being is being killed by ICE.
What is happening right now inside the United States immigration detention system has crossed into a level of urgency that can no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or bureaucratic failures. Another migrant has died while in federal custody, and this time the confirmation did not come from ICE itself, but from the Mexican government. The Mexican Foreign Ministry, through its consular officials, confirmed the death of a Mexican national while being held in U.S. immigration detention.
At which point they said really nothing about the cause of death. They said that the staff observed him in distress and said that an investigation was underway. My sources internally said that there was some indication of a use of force. So I followed that lead. I found out from a witness, an eyewitness, a fellow detainee at this detention center in Texas.
That confirmation makes this the fifth reported death of a migrant in immigration custody this year alone, and it is still only mid-January. At that pace, a human being is dying in federal immigration detention roughly every 3 days. That is not rhetoric, that is math. In this latest case, details are still emerging. But the fact that the information came from a foreign government rather than from U.S. authorities is itself telling. Historically, deaths in immigration custody are often disclosed slowly and completely, or only after pressure from families, journalists, or consular officials. The lack of transparency has been a long-standing concern raised by human rights organizations, immigration attorneys, and medical professionals who monitor detention conditions. Each new death adds to a growing record that suggests systemic problems rather than rare tragedies.
He was insisting on having his medication. He was claiming that he didn't have his medication, and he didn't want to go into the segregation unit without his medication. And that this witness says that they were forcing him to kind of go into that cell. In that ensuing struggle, this witness said that at least 5 guards were essentially choking him and that they eventually choked him to death.
At the same time, another case has now been formally ruled a homicide by a local medical examiner. In El Paso, Texas, the medical examiner determined that the death of a 55-year-old Cuban man held at the El Paso IC Processing Center, also known as Camp East, Montana, was a homicide. According to official findings and reporting, the man died during a physical confrontation with an ICE officer after he allegedly refused to enter a housing unit without access to his prescribed medications. The medical examiner's ruling indicates that the cause of death was consistent with restraint or choking during that struggle.
I learned from the man's family that they'd been in touch with the medical examiner who's reviewing the body, who found evidence of a homicide, and that medical examiner told the family they believe that the manner of death was homicide and the preliminary cause of death was asphyxia due to neck and chest compression.
That ruling elevates the incident from a disputed use of force case to a confirmed homicide under medical standards, a designation that carries serious legal and moral implications. When deaths in custody are ruled homicides, it fundamentally changes the conversation. This is no longer about administrative negligence or medical mismanagement alone. It raises questions about training, accountability, use of force protocols, and whether detention staff are equipped or instructed to de-escalate situations involving medically vulnerable detainees.
The two had never met each other until they were placed inside a holding cell with 5 others. This video, posted Tuesday, shows Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem inside the facility.
They marked their doors with sticky notes. Ours had USC on it for U.S. citizens.
They described the situation inside the detention facility as loud, chaotic, and disorganized.
It also raises questions about why someone in federal custody, dependent on the state for basic care, would be put into a confrontation over access to medication in the first place. These deaths are not occurring in a vacuum. They are unfolding against a broader backdrop of aggressive immigration enforcement operations that are increasingly spilling into public spaces and residential communities.
There was one point they were looking for one particular gentleman for probably about 15, 30 minutes. They kept circling, going, we have no idea where this man is, and kept coming and asking us if we knew where they were.
They say they were in shackles the entire time and had pseudo mugshots taken of them on cell phones.
In Minneapolis and St. Paul, residents and journalists have documented large-scale operations involving ICE, Border Patrol, and Department of Homeland Security personnel that resemble crowd control or tactical law enforcement deployments rather than routine immigration enforcement. Streets have been flooded with agents, some wearing tactical gear, deploying chemical crowd control agents and firing so-called less lethal munitions, such as pepper balls. Independent journalists on the ground have captured video footage showing agents firing pepper balls toward unarmed demonstrators and bystanders.
Yesterday, after I saw the video, I was bawling in my kitchen, and I needed to pick my son up from school, and it's like, you know, it hurts. It hurts us.
Witnesses describe being hit directly, experiencing intense burning sensations, breathing difficulty, and disorientation. While pepper spray and pepper balls are classified as less lethal, medical experts have long warned that they can still cause serious injury, particularly when used indiscriminately or at close range, and especially among people with respiratory conditions.
The pepper ball spray is very strong. They use that to make sure that the crowd stays back. So one of the problems that we see is that some of the protesters are standing behind the media members. You see how upset people are getting?
Even more concerning are reports from residents and journalists that agents have deployed chemical substances that do not resemble standard pepper spray. Witnesses describe greenish clouds or residues causing severe coughing, choking, and eye irritation. Without official disclosure from DHS about exactly what agents are deploying, it is impossible for medical professionals or the public to assess health risks or provide appropriate treatment. The use of unidentified chemical agents against civilian populations raises profound concerns under both domestic law and international human rights standards. Video footage from Minneapolis also shows agents stopping individuals in public spaces and demanding identification. In one widely circulated clip, an officer is heard asking a woman if she has identification. When she does not immediately produce it, the officer states words to the effect of, "Then you're mine," before detaining her. Civil rights attorneys note that under U.S. law, the absence of identification alone is not sufficient grounds for detention in most jurisdictions. Such encounters raise alarms about racial profiling, unlawful detention, and violations of Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. Community members describe these actions as creating an atmosphere of fear and chaos. Families report being afraid to leave their homes, workers avoid commuting, parents keep children indoors. Regardless of one's position on immigration policy, the visible militarization of enforcement operations inside cities has real consequences for public trust, community safety, and constitutional norms. When people perceive federal agents as unpredictable or unaccountable, cooperation with law enforcement collapses and social cohesion erodes. What ties all of these developments together is not just the number of incidents, but the pattern. Multiple deaths in custody within weeks. A homicide ruling involving an ICE officer. Escalating use of force in civilian neighborhoods, chemical agents deployed without transparency, detentions that appear to bypass basic civil liberties. These are not random events. They reflect policy choices, enforcement priorities, and a culture within parts of the immigration enforcement apparatus that increasingly relies on intimidation rather than due process. Supporters of aggressive enforcement argue that officers face difficult and dangerous situations and must protect themselves. That argument deserves consideration, but it does not excuse deaths in custody, nor does it justify the erosion of constitutional protections or the use of force against unarmed civilians exercising their rights. Accountability is not anti-law enforcement. Accountability is what distinguishes a system governed by law from one governed by fear. As more footage emerges and more cases are investigated, the question is no longer whether something is wrong. The question is how much evidence it will take before meaningful oversight reform, or intervention occurs, because every death, every violent encounter, and every unlawful detention deepens a crisis that is no longer confined to detention centers, but is now playing out openly in American cities. What is especially alarming is how quickly these events are escalating from detention center abuses into widespread street-level confrontations between federal immigration agents and civilian communities. Minneapolis and St. Paul have effectively become test cases for what aggressive, militarized immigration enforcement looks like when it is no longer confined to border regions or remote detention facilities, but instead deployed directly into densely populated urban neighborhoods. Residents describe seeing convoys of unmarked or minimally marked vehicles moving through residential streets, agents wearing tactical gear, and operations unfolding with little explanation to the public. People report being stopped outside their homes, near workplaces, and in public areas with no clear indication of why enforcement actions are taking place or who is being targeted. This lack of transparency fuels panic, rumors, and mistrust, especially in immigrant communities where people may already be vulnerable due to language barriers, prior trauma, or fear of retaliation. Journalists embedded in these communities have documented scenes that resemble crowd control operations rather than administrative immigration enforcement. Video footage shows lines of agents advancing while firing pepper balls, dispersing crowds with chemical irritants, and shouting commands that leave little room for de-escalation. People are not shown attacking officers or posing immediate threats in these clips. Instead, they appear to be chanting, filming, or attempting to retreat while being subjected to force. Medical professionals have long warned that pepper balls and chemical irritants are not benign tools. When fired directly at people, pepper balls can cause serious injuries, including bruising, broken skin, eye damage, and respiratory distress. When chemical agents are deployed in enclosed or densely populated areas, they can trigger asthma attacks, panic reactions, and long-term health complications. The fact that some of the substances reportedly used are not clearly identified raises even deeper concerns about compliance with safety protocols and public health standards. Civil liberties advocates note that federal immigration agents operate under a complex and often misunderstood set of authorities. While they have broad powers related to immigration enforcement, those powers are not unlimited. They do not override the Constitution. Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures still apply. Fifth Amendment protections still apply. The right to due process does not disappear because someone lacks legal immigration status. When agents detain people without probable cause, use force indiscriminately, or ignore medical needs, they expose the government to serious legal liability and undermine the legitimacy of enforcement itself. The situation becomes even more troubling when viewed alongside the deaths in custody. A system that cannot keep people alive while they are fully under government control is the same system now asserting expanded authority on city streets. The homicide ruling in El Paso underscores this point. If a person can be killed during a struggle over access to medication inside a secure facility, it raises urgent questions about how similar confrontations are handled in less controlled environments. Families of detainees and victims are now demanding answers, not only about individual cases, but about broader patterns of conduct. Why are medically vulnerable individuals being placed in situations that escalate into fatal encounters? Why are deaths being disclosed by foreign governments or local medical examiners rather than proactively by federal agencies? Why are communities being exposed to chemical agents without clear disclosure of what those substances are? Oversight mechanisms exist on paper. Congress has committees responsible for immigration oversight. The Department of Homeland Security has internal watchdogs. The Office of Inspector General has authority to investigate misconduct, but historically these mechanisms have moved slowly, often after public outrage has already peaked and attention has shifted elsewhere. In the meantime, people continue to die, communities continue to be traumatized, and accountability remains elusive. Another deeply concerning aspect is the language being used by some agents during these operations. Statements implying ownership or dominance over individuals who lack identification evoke historical practices that most Americans believe were left behind. Civil rights historians point out that requiring papers on demand and detaining people based solely on their inability to produce them has a dark lineage, one associated with authoritarian regimes and racial control systems rather than democratic governance. For many residents watching these scenes unfold, the fear is not abstract. Parents worry about children being caught in enforcement operations on their way to school. Workers fear being detained during routine commutes. Entire neighborhoods experience collective stress that affects mental health, economic stability, and trust in institutions. Even people who are citizens or lawful residents report feeling unsafe simply because of how enforcement actions are being carried out. Supporters of current policies often argue that strong enforcement is necessary to uphold the law, but law enforcement that operates without transparency, proportionality, or accountability ultimately undermines the very rule of law it claims to defend. A system that relies on fear rather than fairness does not create security, it creates instability. As these events continue to unfold, the central question is no longer whether immigration enforcement has become more aggressive. That is now undeniable. The question is whether there will be meaningful intervention before more people die, before more communities are traumatized, and before constitutional norms are further eroded. Each new incident adds weight to the argument that what is happening is not a series of isolated mistakes, but a structural crisis in how immigration enforcement is being conducted in the United States. What happens next will define whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long history of unchecked abuses. The legal implications of what is unfolding are severe, and they extend far beyond any single detention center or city. When a medical examiner rules a death in federal custody a homicide, that finding alone triggers obligations under both federal law and international human rights standards. It requires a transparent investigation, preservation of evidence, independent review, and potential criminal liability for those involved. Anything less signals that the government is willing to tolerate lethal misconduct by its own agents. International scrutiny is already intensifying. When foreign ministries are the ones announcing deaths of their nationals in U.S. custody, it reflects a breakdown in diplomatic responsibility. Governments have an obligation to notify families promptly, to cooperate with consular officials, and to explain how someone who entered custody alive did not leave it that way. Each failure compounds diplomatic damage and weakens U.S. credibility when it speaks about human rights abroad. Domestically, civil rights attorneys are preparing for a wave of litigation. Wrongful death suits, constitutional claims, and class actions are increasingly likely if patterns of neglect and excessive force continue. Courts have repeatedly ruled that people in civil detention are entitled to adequate medical care and protection from harm. Unlike criminal incarceration, immigration detention is administrative in nature, which makes deaths resulting from force or neglect even harder to justify legally. The street-level operations raise additional constitutional concerns. Filming agents detaining people without warrants, without identifying themselves clearly, and without articulating lawful cause creates evidentiary records that courts will scrutinize closely. Statements captured on video suggesting possession or ownership over detainees are not just disturbing rhetorically, they are legally dangerous. They suggest arbitrary detention, which is prohibited under both U.S. law and international conventions to which the United States is a party. Congress cannot plausibly claim ignorance. Video evidence, medical examiner rulings, consular disclosures, and first-hand reporting have created a public record that demands oversight. Lawmakers have the authority to subpoena documents, compel testimony, restrict funding, and mandate changes in detention standards and enforcement protocols. Choosing not to act is itself a decision, one that carries consequences for institutional legitimacy. There is also a growing concern within law enforcement and military circles about the long-term effects of deploying federal agents in ways that resemble domestic occupation rather than targeted enforcement. Former officials warn that blurring the line between civil administration and militarized control erodes public trust and places agents themselves in dangerous, unsustainable positions. When communities view federal officers as threats rather than protectors, every interaction becomes more volatile The human cost remains the most important reality. Behind every statistic is a person who had a family, a history, and a reason for being here. The Cuban man in El Paso did not die because of a sentence handed down by a court. He died during a confrontation over access to medication. The migrants who died earlier this year did not die after trials or convictions. They died while the government had complete control over their safety. Those facts cannot be dismissed as unfortunate accidents without dismantling the idea of custodial responsibility itself. What is unfolding is not just an immigration debate. It is a test of whether the United States will enforce its laws within the boundaries of humanity, legality, and accountability. A government can regulate borders without killing people in its care. It can enforce immigration law without terrorizing neighborhoods. It can maintain order without dissolving constitutional norms. If accountability does not follow, the consequences will be lasting. Communities will withdraw further from cooperation with authorities. International partners will escalate criticism. Courts will eventually intervene, but often only after irreparable harm has occurred. History shows that when abuses are normalized, they expand rather than contract. This moment still offers a choice. Transparency can replace secrecy. Oversight can replace impunity. Medical care, due process, and restraint can replace neglect and force. But that choice requires action, not rhetoric. It requires officials willing to confront what is happening honestly and to accept that enforcement without humanity is not strength, it is failure. What people are witnessing now is not chaos without cause. It is the predictable outcome of policies that prioritize speed and spectacle over safety and law. Whether this trajectory continues depends on whether accountability is imposed while it still can be. The record is being built in real time. What happens next will determine how this chapter is remembered, not just by those living through it, but by history itself.